Alrighty, g'day guys, welcome to what I'm sure you can tell is the new tier list for October 2022. So hello, this is actually me talking to you right now. So just quickly we'll go through the tier list. So we've got the top tier being Cantbreak, then basically dropping down each tier the different adjectives, so going from like overpowered, excellent, strong, average, below average, usable, niche use, always garbage, and you may guess which unit ends up in the hooded tier. But yeah, so basically got Cantbreak as the top tier with the tower is just always going to be one of the best in the game. Then as we drop down each tier, it's like, well, the tower is generally really good, and in some spots it will be like one of the best in the game. Generally excellent, some spots it'll be better, right? So it's either, so like, just want to make it clear that in some situations, like, towers will move up or down, of course, and but the ranking will try and reflect that, at least to some extent, if that makes sense. Yeah, the other two things that are worth pointing out. One, this tier list is going to be focused on level 1 to 21. I'll do like a separate little video about the endgame stuff, but it's very, very different as you get into the late stages of the game, so we're just going to focus on sort of 1 to 21, which is the early and mid game. I could have gone to 24, but I figured for one extra level, I didn't really want to have to think about 24, to be honest, so you'll forgive me for that. The other thing to note is this is with general reference to the Lil meta, right? And obviously without going too in detail, I'd say the basic matter is that if you're not a carry lane, you want to be 3-0 at least early, as in 3-0 for level 3. You don't want to be 2-0 for level 3 unless your role justifies it, as in your role is good and will look to carry. The other thing that's worth noting is that generally teams are looking for like 1 to 2 carries, and then 2 to 3 pushes, right? So lanes that can't do either of those things, or units that aren't very good at doing either of those things, even if they might be good units in some situations, are going to have a really hard time ranking ranking at the top. And there's one more thing to mention as well, and that's that the list is going to be weighted more heavily towards the early game and then going on towards the mid game, right? The reasoning for that is every single game has an early game, not every single game has a mid game. As I'm sure you've seen on my channel, and I've tried not to give you too many of those games because I know they're boring, a lot of games end on 10, right? It is fairly common, so definitely the first 10 levels are going to have a little bit of a higher weighting than the next, say, 5, and then, so biggest weighting is going to be like 1 to 10, then it'll be like 10 to 15, then like 16 to 21 has a little bit less weighting, so that should be reflected in some of the units on the tier list, right? But just to sort of make that clear. Anyway, get right into it. So Parasite is first up. We're just going to drop Parasite straight in the generally OP tier, after the Parasite changes, giving it the DPS increase on the unit as well. It's just become so strong on so many units. I am very rarely am I unhappy to see Parasite in my role. And the times I am unhappy to see it, it's basically because I have Aqua, and then I have Aqua, so it's fine anyway. The worst thing about it is that it doesn't work as a blocker on 10, but this unit is so good, it makes the other good units better, and it feels really noticeable. So Parasite is awesome. Okay, next up we've got Rider. That ends up in the generally strong tier, so generally Rider is quite good. It falls off pretty hard after 7, but this unit is solid on 3, so it generally tends to not completely deny you 3-0 if you mix it early, as in for level 3, and it's very good on 5 and 7. As I said, it's not great on 10, but it still provides a reasonable amount of damage, so it does its job pretty well. Happy to see Rider in my role. Really is one of those units that will just generally be pretty good. It situationally is rarely better than this, and obviously sometimes it will be worse, but I think it deserves to be in this generally strong category. Okay, next up we have Null. Null is dropping straight into the slightly below average tier. which might sound weird, but hear me out. So Null is really, really good on level 10. It is really good on level 10. What I've basically decided that units that are really good on one level, specifically like 7 and 10, end up in this tier, right? Because situationally, they're like better. Because Null is, it's not quite a solution to 10 by itself, but it's almost a solution by itself, right? Decided that units like that probably that aren't really good for doing much else at least, end up in this tier. So we're gonna have Null in the below average, but yeah, it's very good on 10. Besides that, pretty weak tier 1, doesn't really do much for you. Alright, next up we've got the Militia, so that ends up just one tier above the Rider. Militia to me basically feels like a better Rider. It does what Rider does, but it also has the niche of you can play it by itself with a hammer mix, and that can work reasonably well. It's better on 8 as part of a YOLO and add to some other YOLO mix with the axe, and it also is better in the mid game than Rider, because again you can go axe. Axe is pretty good on 12 and 14. Not amazing, but axe light armor for 14 is quite solid, and just axe for 12. Not amazing, but will do reasonably well for you, so no complaints about Militia. I think it's basically Rider, but a little bit better. Next up with Proton, I believe we're dropping that, yeah, in the same tier as Null. If you're wondering, I've gone through this tier list already, and actually I should have said this at the start, but sorry, let me take a quick break and say it now. Tier list, so I made like a quick sort of 10-15 minute first impressions from me, and then sent it to a bunch of players, got some feedback from them, made some changes, and this is the version that you guys are seeing. So even though I am doing it by myself, in terms of the explanations, I have had a lot of feedback and input from other players, and I definitely did change some things. I didn't change everything, of course, even if the feedback was given, because, you know, in the end it's going to be my tier list, my opinion. But there are definitely a few things that were picked up on by a lot of players that I missed the first time over, so I appreciate all the help they gave me. Anyway, Proton going in the below average tier, so Proton is like not bad because it's a 20 gold range tier 1, it sort of does its job. But the range is really short, and it tends to walk quite close to the creep, so it's a little bit worse in that sense than something like Acolyte. Adept is okay, Adept is definitely usable. The main thing with Adept is the increment is bad on 4 and 6, and the armor type is bad on 4. So even though it's pretty good on level 3, it's like hard to use it efficiently on level 3 with a lot of units, because it's then weak on 4. So that can be a little bit difficult, and then it's not actually that good on 6. So even though Adept is a lot better than it used to be and feels a lot more usable, it's still not that great. So I think Proton just goes in below average. Like, it's okay, but that's kind of all it is. Next up, we've got Peewee. Peewee, as I've said a number of times in videos, is probably my least favorite tier 1 as like just a tier 1. I think the 25 gold Peewee is crap because it's expensive and fragile. It does like a good amount of damage for a melee tier 1, but it's a melee tier 1, so it just dies instantly. So I think if it was just Peewee, he'll go like here. But Veteran is a decent unit. You can play it, well, you can play it by itself. I would really try not to play Veteran by itself. But it does have a solid number of good mixes, including things like Ghoul, things like Corrupted End, things like Mouth. You can play Veteran with a decent number of mixes, find relative success. I also actually really like it with an Infantry and Spider mix, because those allow you to start 3-0 and then play the game out from there. I would never really want to play this unit just starting it as itself, but with a few mixes it can provide that bulky frontline that works well. Has good increments on 3 and 5, bad increment on 4, so if you can get a bit of help with some units there, it can make it a lot better. Yeah, it's just like a slightly worse than average YOLO, but it does the job. Some of its mixes will put it there, unmixed it's there, so it sort of ends up in this category here. Right, next up we've got Parrot. Parrot is just going in the average to situationally strong tier, and that's because Parrot with the wrong mix is like really bad, but Parrot with mixed with AoE is really, really nice. Parrot on 10 as a blocker is also quite good because of that reflect damage. You know, as it will function as a blocker and also do like 200 damage to a boss, which is quite nice. But yeah, with AoE units like Cannon, EA, Disciple units like this, really, really solid. With single target units like Veteran, Landlubber, Ig, things like this, it's pretty bad. So, you know, make sure you know what you're doing when you use the Parrot, or make sure you're mixing it with the units that it likes mixing with. But when it has those good mixes, it's quite strong. Yeah, you'll notice this is one of the units that definitely dropped down since the last tier list. Alright, next up we've got Bone Warrior. So, Fire Archer is like here, Skeletor is like here, Bone Warrior as a tier 1 is probably like here, and then Dark Mage makes it here. So yeah, Dark Mage is one of the best supporting units in the game, just giving attack speed to a single unit, which is based off of how like expensive it is and some other stuff. So it basically targets good units generally. For 105 gold is just ridiculous. This unit is so good. It is so good. Again, like the only time I'm not using Dark Mage in an early YOLO is when I'm playing Aqua, and then I'm playing Aqua, so it's fine anyway. Dark Mage, well, Bone Warrior, because of Dark Mage, is definitely one of the best units in the game. There are definitely some spots where it jumps up to here. It supports expensive units like Doomsday, like Griffin in the later stages of the mid-game extremely well. But obviously it's not that strong with the majority of units, so that's why it ends up in the second to highest tier. So we've got Engineer, just going to drop in the average tier. It's playable by itself. With just Engineer, I would generally not do it. It is quite a good unit, and look, there is a case for bringing it up here, but I think a lot of the games are quite fast from what I'm seeing recently, so I don't like Engineer quite as much as I would in a slower sort of matter. Clog is also really on the out and out, so very rarely am I going to play Engineer and the other team is going to Clog, and then I'll be like, oh sweet, I just take over the game now. That tends to not really happen. So Engineer, you know, playable by itself. You can add it to some units. It works nicely with Disciple, it works not that well with most other things. And then Mutant in the mid-game is good for 17, but that's about it. So, you know, it's a solid unit. Sometimes it will definitely be better with Exac, for example. It jumps up. It really likes Exac, but besides that, I think this unit is, you know, average or slightly better. So okay unit. Alright, next we have Ent. Ent is going to just drop in the below average tier, because, actually no, Ent is going to drop down a tier because it's like these guys, but just a bit worse because it doesn't have a niche as an upgrade. Ent itself is a solid tier 1 because it is quite tanky. I actually like the 20 gold tier 1 quite a bit, but it just has less other uses than these guys here. It's gonna drop in this tier. Poor Ent. I kind of feel like he deserves to be here, but he's not that great. So, all right, Wolverine. Same deal as Null. A tower that just sort of solves one level ends up in this tier for me because Wolverine is good on 10 and pretty unexciting after that and on any other level. So, you know, it does its thing. It can do its thing pretty well, but it's pretty one-dimensional in that sense. It was very strong for a little bit, then it got nerfed. I think it may have gotten nerfed twice in terms of the scaling ramp on the crit chance, and it's just ended up as like, you know what, it's pretty good for level 10, but it's not that insane. Kind of need the right setup with it in terms of other frontline or things to tank for it. Some units obviously of those will show up later, so yeah, it solves one good level, so it ends up in this tier. Besides that, it's fairly weak. Next up, we've got the Tusker Spearman. This guy's just going to end up here. The reasoning for that is, like, it's basically, I'd say the 20 gold is worse than Ent, but the actual upgraded Spearman is really not that bad a unit. It's two-shotting on level 2, which gives it a bit of a niche there, if you want to use it early, generally not though. but the slow and the damage on level 10 is actually quite nice. So I think fairly often when you have this guy, you build one of him for level 10 and it can feel pretty good in a lot of setups. And if you are desperate, you can build more for 10 as damage, and that sort of works. Landline, Wolverine and Null should end up as no surprise that Landmine is here. Landmine is the best solution to level 7 when you're really just trying to kill a lot of creeps. It is extremely bad after that. It's not very good on 8, not very good on 9, and obviously like horrendous on 10, scales down extremely hard in the mid game to the point where I think this is probably the only unit you would invest. How much does it cost again? 160 gold? Yeah, 160 gold. And this is a unit you just sell to get 80 gold back, because 80 gold of something else is better than 160 gold of landmine in the mid game. But 160 gold of landmine is better than like 350 gold of other things on 7 pretty often. So yeah, landmine is for level 7. It's difficult to use or to make significant use out of earlier than that because it obviously doesn't affect level 5. So even if you can manage to get a wisp early by using landmine, you then generally lose that wisp because you have to build extra on level 5 since you've got the landmines, and it's dead value after the 7, so difficult to use early unless you're already planning from like level 1, level 2 to use landmine on 7, and I would say it's generally, you want it to be more of a flex option. Like, hey, is me staying, 1 to 2 pushes lower on 7 to clear with landmines actually going to help? But does my roll justify that, or does it not? Sometimes it will, sometimes you'll not want to do that. So yeah, landmine ends up here. Sometimes it's really, really good because it is the best at solving level 7 with low value, and quite often you'll have it in a roll and never use it. So, Right, Hatchling, basically same tier as Null because 10 gold tier 1 is already fairly solid. And then sometimes you can build Fangtooth if you have nothing else. Fangtooth is not in this tier. If this was just Fangtooth, it would drop down here. But because it is just a 10 gold tier 1, it ends up being pretty usable. It's not exciting, but it's definitely better than Ent. So yeah. So we're going to jump into another good tier 1. This guy is going to be Rat, and he's going to end up in the generally strong tier. So I feel like, at least for me, when I have Rat, I very rarely don't build one for Rat, but I basically never go for more than that. I'd say generally Rat is able to solve pretty well. It's quite strong on the first 3 levels, a bit weak on 4, but after that it is tanky. It's also a very convenient way to just invest spare gold as a YOLO. Because it's like, oh, I have 30 gold, what am I going to do with that? I'm going to buy a Rat. It's very convenient in that sense because you spend just the 30 gold and your lane gets stronger, but you don't lose a farm slot. So you can mix Rat with a lot of the good YOLOs that will be coming, like Akron Archer, things like that. And it does, don't want to say it makes them better, but it's definitely a side grade, not a downgrade. Obviously it doesn't play quite as nicely by itself, but solid unit overall, decent for level 10. As a blocker unit, but not the most exciting, but honestly just quite strong. Definitely its strength on level 3 is a big upside for Rat. It can often help units that are a bit weaker on level 3 get that extra wisp to get into the 3-0 relatively safely without risking half the lane or more to a Blood Orc on 3. Alright, next up we've got Spectre. Spectre is also going to end up in this tier because Spectre is a good unit. It is really strong on level 4, it's solid on level 1 and 2, little weak on 3, and then sort of just becomes a bit irrelevant after that. But of just like the tier 1s that you don't upgrade, it competes with Rat for the best, and Spectre is the damaging option, Rat is the tanking option. So yeah, really, really solid. And add Spectre to a lot of the sort of lower to average tier mix YOLOs, and it will just make your lane better. It will get you a wisp, it will get you through level 4 much more easily if your mix is a little weak on level 4. So yeah, really solid tier 1, no complaints about Spectre. I guess the worst thing you could say about Spectre is it's not that impactful, like it doesn't do that much, but it's just quite good. So yeah. Next up we've got Acolyte. Acolyte is basically just a little bit worse Spectre. Revenant is really not particularly good even on 15, partly because of Firelord, and partly because level 14 comes before level 15, which is a big problem for Revenant. So yeah, this unit is not really playable by itself. There's like a Revenant YOLO that's a bit of a relic from like 2017. You can do it still, but I would generally stay away from the actual upgrade. Unless I just need to spend my gold, then I don't really have a better way to do that. But Acolyte itself is a reasonable tier 1. It basically seems like Spectre, but a bit worse to me, in terms of the 20 gold tier 1 versus the 25 gold Spectre. So that's why it lands in this tier. It is reasonable. Probably the definition of average. Alright. Moving on to the tier 2s, we have Spider. Spider is quite good. It is good on level 10. It's quite solid on level 10. It's a reasonable damaging option for level 7. Not the best for sure, but it's reasonable. So I guess basically Rider and Spider feels like Rider is the level 7 and Spider is the level 10. Whichever you need in that game is going to be more useful. We're saying the unupgraded Spider, definitely quite bad on 3, but actually not bad on 2. So don't sleep on like 3 unupgraded Spiders for level 2 if you're not working with much else. Can do its thing. So yeah, it's like a reasonable unit. It falls off somewhat in the mid game, but it does have enough range to actually sit in the back. The debuff against the Kraken and the Firelord, they are nice, not super impactful because it doesn't do enough damage to the Kraken and Firelord to make it that impactful, but definitely gives it a leg up over something like Rider in the mid game as well. So yeah, that's Spider. It's fairly good. A lot of the time, if you're looking for a carry setup, if you're looking to take feed, and you have Spider in your role, you're going to use Spider, at least a couple of them, quite often. So yeah, it's fairly solid. Next up, we've got Warlock. Warlock drops in the average tier. So the unupgraded Warlock is generally not a great unit. It can be good for some tanky setups on 10 and 20, specifically the boss levels. Beyond that, wouldn't use it. The upgraded version is quite strong. If I have this in the mid game, I'm generally building at least 1, no matter what level I think they're sending, except for 16, I guess, and 12, not that great on range levels, because it is somewhat short range. Yeah, the armor reduction is definitely quite nice, but very weak on the first 9 levels. Really is quite a bad unit before level 10, so that's what gives him this ranking. If he was good or a bit better, those first 9 levels he would end up here, but because of the weakness there, he will just end up in this tier, even though he's quite strong in the mid game. It's also a case of, unless you're expecting the other team to send on 15, you're generally only building 1 and maybe 2 of this guy, 15 or 20 I guess. Generally only building 1 or 2 of this guy. But, you know, he is decent. He's decent at what it does, and if you need help killing Sens, specifically the biggest one being the Behemoth, if you need help killing a Behemoth in particular, Warlock can help a lot of units do that. Alright, next up we've got Corrupted Ent. Drops in the below average, situationally good tier. Reasoning for that is Corrupted Ent by itself is pretty bad because good luck on 5. But Corrupted Ent can make a lot of units a lot better. So and how does Corrupted Ent do that? It's extremely strong on 1, 2 and 3, and it's pretty good on 4. So you can mix it with a bunch of units, get yourself extra wisp with extra safety in the early game at the cost of maybe 160 to 200 dead value. Generally, I'm pretty happy with that. So for example, if I had something like Monk, I would be, hey, I can start Monk 3-0, I can add 3 Corrupted Ents on 2, I can build a little bit more on 3, so I can build like maybe my tier 3 and let's say a Captain and another Corrupted Ent on 3. That will be really strong versus Blood Orc. I will probably go mid versus Blood Orc on 3. Then that will hold 4, and I can add like another Monk on 5. Yes, I end up a little bit overbuilt, but if I think my lane is a carry lane, it's okay to play safely like that. So that's just an example of where Corrupted Ent would be quite good. It just is a really nice bridge unit to get you through the first 3 to 4 levels with other units which may be very, very strong, but might have a weakness on those first few levels. By itself, quite bad. When mixed with other units like that, very, very solid. Right, so next up we've got Ranger. Ranger, similarly to Warlock, is going to end up in the average tier. The thing with Ranger is, like, if you don't have other Pierce, it's pretty bad. If you do have other Pierce, it's really good, so it is a little bit difficult to rate this unit, and it's just going to be very situational. But I would say overall Pierce is quite valuable because level 7 has light armor and level 10 has light armor. And those are probably two of the most important levels in the game in the sort of current little meta. So those levels being very important, Pierce being the best damage type on those levels, generally means, and I think this will reflect in the tier list a reasonable amount, that Pierce is fairly valuable. And because Pierce is fairly valuable, Ranger gets like a bit of a better rating than it probably would. Otherwise, I would most likely say Ranger is in this tier and sometimes it's better. But because Pierce in general is good, I would say Ranger is sort of gets that extra ranking because a lot of the time it will actually be a very, very good unit for your role. It is just needs the other units, the other Pierce damage to make it worthwhile. It's by itself, you can try and damage 10 with like melee and then mass ranges. It works, but it's not very good, so it's one of those things I would generally only do it if I was sort of desperate. So yeah. Next up we've got Solar Villain. It's basically shitty Warlock. And that's just how it is. It is basically shitty Warlock. Solar Hero has no usage at all, really. I mean, you can use it, but it's fairly bad. The unupgraded Wanderer is quite shit, honestly. So it's only got that Solar Villain niche, and it's just a lot worse than the Warlock because it does a lot less damage and it reduces less armor. It does have more range than the Warlock, which is nice in some setups, but generally I don't value the extra range nearly as highly as I value the unit just being generally better. So in terms of competing options, it is significantly worse than Warlock, but sometimes it will be good, because if you need help killing Sens, it can help you do that. I would generally not build a Solar Villain for that, but I generally would build a Warlock. So I'd say this unit's, I mean, again, it's like whenever I have it, it's like, well, I wish it was Warlock, but I guess it's worth building. So it does its job, but it's not particularly good. Alright, next up we have Crusader. Crusader is basically on the same tier as Corrupted Ent for more or less the same reason as Corrupted Ent. It has less mixed potential since you do need to upgrade it to actually make it worthwhile. So the increment is 150 gold rather than 40 gold, which makes it more difficult. But as a standalone unit, it is better than Corrupted Ent because it attacks pretty quickly, has good increments on every level except level 3. But yeah, it's good, generally good enough on level 3 to the point where you can have decent push with it early on. So it's not a super exciting unit, but it sort of does its job relatively well. A lot of the time, if you have other units to mix it with, especially things that are good on level 5 or at least tankier on level 5, can be quite a nice unit to have to help you out with the first couple of levels. This thing, Solar holding level 1 at 150 value, being quite strong one-shotting 2 and evenly two-shotting 4, makes it very, very solid for those first 4 levels. So comparable to Corrupted Ent in that sense, where it is a better standalone unit than Corrupted Ent, but it doesn't work quite as well when mixed, just because, again, it is harder to mix a 150 gold unit than it is to mix a 40 gold unit. Alright, next up we have the Dwarf Tier 2, which is called Dwarf Fighter? Yeah, Dwarf Fighter. I always just call it Tier 2 Dwarf. Anyway, this guy's really strong. He's playable by himself. It's basically like super Corrupted Ent, is the way to think about it, because he's just so damn tanky. So this guy works really nicely for holder setups or overbuild setups. You can build damage dealers behind him. He'll sort of like hold the front line. He scales to some extent into mid-game as well. If you upgrade a few of them, they get extra armor, so they get actually relatively tanky. I'm not particularly excited to do this, but if you do just need like things to take damage on like say 12 or 14, this guy's okay at doing that. Same story on level 10 I guess as well. But yeah, it's basically, it's really good on the first 4 levels. Needs a lot of help on 5, does need a lot of help on 5, but if you have the units to give it that help on 5, it is extremely, extremely good. So it ends up in this spot because compared to these guys, it's just better. It really is just better. We'll do the same thing as Corrupted Ent. We'll do the same thing as Crusader. It will do them better. And it will also give you the option for overbuild, and it will also scale into the mid-game. So that's why it ends up 2 tiers above them, even though it is a rather similar unit. So yeah, next up, Aqua. No surprises with Aqua. Ends up in the second top tier. So Aqua just being one of the best YOLOs, one of the also most fair towers to play against, which may sound weird considering how high it is in the tier list, but Aqua just, it does its thing. It's not super strong anywhere. It's just very, very consistent, very, very simple, and works nicely setting up a base for a good mid-game with high income and a relatively low amount of dead value, as low as 550, which is, yeah, really, really nice if you get away with 150 odd income. So Aqua is just, it's just excellent. It does everything pretty well except level 9. So yeah, Aqua is good. What a shocker. Next up we have Frostwolf. So I will confess I don't know enough about this unit to comfortably give it a rating myself. From all the feedback I've seen, it's pretty bad. So yeah, got the ability changed to what is essentially like, I think of it as ice shards, so when it hits something and that something dies, it explodes and deals some AoE damage. It's flat damage, so it doesn't scale whatsoever, and unfortunately it's still like normal damage, medium armor, awkward increments on 3 and 6. It's just, I don't know, this unit's just not very good, unfortunately. So I'll say maybe there's more exploration to be done with this, maybe it mixes nicely now, I'm not sure, but I think for now I'm going to say this unit is generally something to avoid. So it's sort of like sometimes you might want to use it, occasionally, but generally it's going to be pretty bad. It could possibly go in this tier, in the basically always garbage tier as well. This is kind of benefit of the doubt. Right, next up we've got Landlubber. So Landlubber is really, really solid. The reasoning for, well, I mean, basically Landlubber, it's pretty solid every level early. It's a bit weak on 4 vs Send, but you can play around that because the increment's nice. You can use this as an overbuild. Basically, like, I think of this unit as sort of Dwarf Fighter. In the sense that, like, yeah, you can use it as a front line for overbuild and it works pretty well. I would rather have Dwarf Fighter for that. And then you can play it by itself, but you can actually play it by itself because it's completely fine on level 5 and actually pretty good on level 8. It's honestly pretty good on level 5 when you play Undead as well. So yeah, really like this unit. It's very able to play as a carry with certain other units. that it can get through. It can bridge through the first 3 to 4 levels with, or you can just play it by itself, and it's like quite a good YOLO. It's honestly quite good. So yeah, really nice unit. No complaints about Landlower. Next up we have Infantry. Infantry is just like pretty good. Zeus is definitely not one of the best Pierce units, but it does well enough, and the unupgraded Infantry will do fairly well in a lot of mixes because it's quite solid level 2 and level 5. Honestly, not a whole lot to say. Infantry's always been like pretty solid. And it's just like a bit better than average most of the time. I would basically never build Pyro though. Pyro is good on level 4, and that is kind of it, unfortunately, so poor Pyro. Right, next up we have Servant. So Servant is one of those units that it's going to go in the average tier, but it's basically Servant by itself really sort of ends up here. Servant when it has, or Slave Master when it has damage dealers in its role, and you can just bridge through, again, this is going to be like a keyword, bridge through the first few levels with Slave Master, and then end up fat in the rest of the early or in the later stages of the early game with this unit, with damage dealers behind it, like, not to be too much of a spoiler, but things like Time Stealer, Sniper, it's really quite good. So you might ask, why is it below the Dwarf Fighter when it can play by itself and when it does the same thing as the Dwarf Fighter? I mean, the reasoning for me is Dwarf Fighter gets you more push, more quickly, and Dwarf Fighter doesn't die to warriors, and it doesn't suck level 4. So Slave Master has major issues versus warrior, major issues versus level 4 send unless you're super high value. I would say Slave Master, unless you have a Time Stealer on 4, I am not confident with Slave Master unless I'm like 670 value, and even then, I'm not necessarily that confident. So if you have your like perfect sort of game with Slave Master, where both teams just like go king, then yeah, Slave, and you have say Time Stealer, so Slave, Time Stealer, Dwarf Tier 2, Time Stealer, both teams go king, yeah, I'm probably a little bit happier to have Slave. But realistically, against the early sends, the Dwarf Tier 2 is a lot more stable, and doesn't invite a spawn on 10 quite so much. Slave Master does not appreciate spawn on 10. You can also generally get away with investing a lot less value of Dwarf Tier 2, and you have to build up a little bit more of like quote unquote dead value with the slaves when you play Slave Master, compared to the Dwarf Tier 2, which is not a major issue, especially because you get some of that gold back from the slave trade, but I would definitely say that it's noticeably worse in my eyes than the Dwarf Tier 2. But in situations where it's good, it's very good. Situations where you just have it by yourself, or by itself, it's pretty unremarkable, and I would generally avoid playing it by itself. Right. Next up we've got Exac. Exac is just like rarely bad. It's basically worth building in all ranged YOLOs and a lot of melee ones. Generally don't get more than one Exac, fairly rare that I do. Some units justify it, majority of them don't. Yeah, it's just like pretty solid. Sky Dragon does have a niche on 5 now, which is really nice. It used to suck on 5, which was just embarrassing, but now it's pretty reasonable on 5. Well, it's quite good on 5. Very bad on other levels, but that's kind of how it should be. So you can do things like Engineer Sky Dragon with the Exacs, and then it's like really nice. This unit is just almost always going to be, you build one and you're pretty happy about it, so yeah, Exac is good. Alright, next up we've got Ogre. It's kind of like Solar Villain level, one where it's like, yeah, it's kind of good on 10, but it's kind of worse than like Null, kind of worse than Parrot. It's okay in the early, but it's kind of worse than Corrupted Ant. So, you know, you can use this unit, but I would generally not be excited about it. Alright, next up I've got Clock. And I'm actually going to put this in the below average tier. So, Clock, and trying not to sound like too much of a broken record, But Dwarf Tier 2, Slave Master, Clock, all have the same niche in terms of overbuilding, with damage dealers behind. So I'm just going to use Time Stealer as the example for all three. And I think Clockwork does... I think it honestly does do the worst out of all three. It's very weak on level 1. It's awkward on level 3 compared to these two units because the increment is 170 gold. So you either have to risk level 3 a little bit, and it sounds weird to say that level 3 is awkward when you have Clockwork, but if you haven't got a nice tier 1, 3 or 4 to add on that level 3 that's relatively cheap and works with the rest of your build, it's like, what do you do? Do you push and then maybe leak? And maybe leak kind of a lot to Blood Orc? And I know some people will tell you that, oh, 2 Clockworks clears Blood Orc, it often doesn't. And it often doesn't get that close. So while Clockwork is very good on 3, it can be a little difficult without the right sort of adds in an overbuild setup if you're just trying to maximize one unit and you don't have other good supporting options. Wikarn 1, and I would say it's also the worst, like, significantly, or these two units here are significantly better on level 10 than the Clockwork. So while it is pretty good in that overbuild setup with Time Stealer, I think it's a little bit worse than either of these guys, and it's also, I would say, feels weird to say it's the worst to play on its own, but you really need a solution for level 5 with this guy. This guy's kind of meh, and you need a solution for level 6 with this guy, so it really doesn't get an extra, like, boost for, oh, you can play Clockwork on its own. And it's like, well, you can, but fucking good luck level 6. So I would generally stay away from that. More or less without exactly Magnetor, unfortunately. But yeah, Clock is fine, but I think it is the least exciting of these 3 units. They all have the same niche. I think Clock does it the worst, and I think Dwarf Tier 2 does it the best. So yeah, that's the justification for that. Elite Archer, probably to the shock of no one, ends up just in the same tier as Aqua. Archer pushes a bit better than Aqua, around level 5, and then is a lot better on level 9, so you can generally get away with going a little bit higher push. Aqua, you can push a little bit faster in the early game, with the exception of a few mixes from Archer, I guess. It pushes a little bit slower than Aqua in the early game, pushes a little bit higher and faster around the sort of later early game, as in like 5 specifically, but 5, 6. Generally push a little bit more with Archer and get away with it. Definitely more on 9. And then Aqua plays a lot more nicely with carry setups in the mid game, and Archer tends to want to push in the mid game a little bit more and just go for more of a clear. But yeah, they fulfill a similar niche early game, just being good YOLOs. Archer is a bit more flexible as well, because you do have like the overbuild option for level 5 and even level 7, which is minor, but it is nice. Then it's worth touching on the mid game quickly that Archer is generally going to be, well, Archer has like a very, very strong niche on a few levels in the mid game, specifically 12, 13, 16, and technically 19. It's also quite good on 21 compared to Aqua. So Archer, I would say it's a little bit worse than Aqua in the early game and for setting up the mid game, but as a standalone unit, especially going into that mid game, it's definitely better than Aqua. So that's why it earns its place in the same tier. But yeah, it is just a very good unit. Akron Archer is a debate, and it's generally based on preference, I would say. I kind of prefer Archer, even though I kind of think Aqua might be slightly better. But yeah, they're close enough that they certainly deserve the same tier. Alright, next up we've got Ghoul. Ghoul just ends up in the same tier as Clockwork. With the right adds, Ghoul is quite nice, but if you're just playing it by itself, it is fairly weak. Ghoul is also very vulnerable early, because if it breaks to, or if it leaks a lot to any early sends, the Ghoul ends up underfed, and there is a big difference between a ghoul that 2 shots level 5 and is pretty good, and a ghoul that 3 shots level 5 and is pretty shit. So, risky unit to play. With the right adds, things like Marth, things like Veteran, things like Dark Mage. I don't mind Ghoul at all, but it's not that great of a unit. Even though I like it, I do like it personally, I don't think it deserves any higher than this tier. Alright, next up we've got Tribesman. Tribesman to me seems like the definition of like it's just kind of worse than a lot of other things that do the same. You can definitely use it. Like I talked about how pierce damage was good. Tribesman is pierced, or Alpha Male is pierce damage. It's just not that good pierce damage, so you know, sort of does its thing, but it's not like great. Alright, next up, Sprite. Sprite is going, sorry I dropped it there, it's meant to go here, in the below average category. So Sprite is pretty fine in the early game, but it's a bit weak on 5, 6, 7, 8. So it gets sort of 4 levels in a row where it's not that great, which is a little bit difficult for it. You might say like, oh, but Thunderbird's really good level 15. It's like, it's pretty good level 15, honestly. It feels like, again, against Firelord, it's you're a little less reliant sort of just on those good magic damage units than you are on just having good frontline and not blowing up to the Firelord. So I think it's a little bit less of a catch-all on 15 than it used to be. And the other thing about Thunderbird on 15 is, as I've hinted at before, what comes before level 15 is level 14. So if you're building a lot of Thunderbirds, you're not going to be very good on level 14. It can be quite difficult to get away with that in a lot of games. I would generally say that level 14 is, I would say it's more important than level 15 realistically, which sounds weird to say, given that I've played in a level 15 meta for a million fucking years. But yeah, it almost feels like it's, if it hasn't swung the other way, it's, in terms of level 14 being more important, it's bloody close to it. So it's going to affect the rating of a lot of these sort of magic damage units and level 15 answers. But yeah, so Sprite ends up as like, sometimes it's pretty good if you're convinced it's level 15, otherwise I would say it's just a bit on the weak side. It's okay. Right, next up we've got Cannon. Cannon is pretty damn good. So Cannon's going to end up in the generally excellent tier. So I'd say as a just YOLO pushing unit, it's a bit worse than Akron Archer. It's not hugely worse, but it is a bit worse. Cannon, of course, is very, very good on level 17. So good job to Cannon for that, but it's definitely not great on like 14, 15. It's okay, it's like alright at shooting the sends, but it's pretty bad at shooting the actual mobs. So it doesn't really bring itself back there. It's also quite weak on level 10, so even though you definitely can damage 7 or look to overbuild 7 with Cannon, somewhat successfully, very successfully with Exact specifically, generally doesn't translate that well into level 10, so it's a little bit difficult to justify doing that a lot of the time, because again, as I've mentioned in other videos, I'd say a reasonable amount. If you are sort of staying a bit lower push, taking a lot of gold into your own lane, level 7, unless the game is already quite high in value, so quite a fat game, maybe because there are lots of king legs, lots of time, someone clogged, whatever. Unless that's the case, if you're taking a lot of gold into your own lane on level 7, a lot of the time you kind of need to pay that back on 10. That makes sense, by doing a good amount of damage on 10, which Cannon is not great at doing. That's not to say that being potentially quite good on level 7 is a takeaway from Cannon. No, it's certainly a positive for Cannon. I just don't want to sort of overstate how often or how common it is to actually go for that sort of overbuild 7 with Cannon. I'd say it's somewhat rare. But the unit is very, very good. So yeah. one of the, probably I would say the best anti-17 at the moment, which is quite nice. Just 17, not hugely common. Anyway, Nightsaber. I really like Nightsaber. I think it's actually an excellent unit. It's very, very good on 7 and 10. If you choose to overbuild with it. Very good on 4, 5, 8. Pretty reasonable on 6. So that sounds like a really nice YOLO. Level 3 is difficult. Generally, I would say do not want to be 2-0 with Nightsaber on 3. So that can be a challenge if you have other units to get around that. Things like Dark Mage, Parasite, Egg Sack, Corrupted Ent that we talked about. If you have Crusader works as well. If you have things like that to get you over that 2-0 level 3 hump, then this unit's fucking nuts. You can take over games fairly easily with the Nightsaber just being really solid on 7 and 10 with good push. And yeah, it's flexible in that sense, which makes it strong. Feels like Cannon. I mean, if I compare it to Cannon, it's like, I'd say Nightsaber is better on 7 and 10. And basically, Cannon has its niche of I'm good on 17. And Cannon has its other niche over Nightsaber being like, I don't suck on 3. Nightsaber's like, yeah, but I'm better on 7 and 10, you know? So they're kind of comparable in that sense. I would probably have to say that Cannon is the better unit, because getting that early push on 3 consistently is really, really valuable. But Nightsaber, when you can get that early push, is definitely deserves this tier. If you can't, it goes a tier down, but I would generally say that I'd say that in most roles you can find a way, and if you have to take the risk, then maybe it's not so bad to take the risk. And you know what, some games you have a really good role with Nightsaber, the team needs an overbuild, you can overbuild with it and hold 7 and 10, and you just need to be 2-0 for 3. If that's the case, then it's okay. It's okay when the role that is going to sort of get the team through the early game is 2-0 on 3, it's not okay when the role that's meant to push is 2-0 on 3. Okay, Ice Troll. Ice Troll is good. Ice Troll is ending up in center as Egg Sack. It's just, you know, it's a solid aura. Works really nicely with AoE setups, and then scales well into mid-game. It's a solid unit. You generally don't build lots of them, you generally build one unupgraded one and one upgraded one, and then never touch them again. But, you know, it does a reasonable amount of damage overall, so solid unit. Just say it's like generally pretty good. Alright, next up, got Bottom Feeder. So Crab is a weird unit, because it's pretty good in 2, 3. It's pretty good in 3 scenarios. Firstly is with Tok, Tree of Knowledge. Secondly is getting a Dwarf King on level 2. And thirdly is like sometimes you just need a lot of help for one level because your units suck there, you build a crab, and then maybe they're a lot stronger for the next level and you sell that crab. So it's like pretty nice in about 3 spots, and besides that is pretty bad. It's a cool unit, it's really interesting. Sometimes sometimes it feels pretty awesome to have a crab because it's like you can do lots of weird things that maybe you wouldn't normally be able to do. But say the vast majority of the time you have this unit, you just won't build it and it will just take up a slot doing absolutely nothing. So yeah, difficult to rate. But it's just one of those things, like when it's good, it's really good. Most of the time it just does absolutely nothing. Because as an actual fighting unit, the crab is quite bad. Okay, next up, Phantom. So Phantom definitely just deserves to be in this tier. It is okay. A lot of the time it's just worse than building units that can hit Sens, because killing Sens is really important. Sometimes if you have just a tanky frontline and then you roll into Hellraisers in the mid-game, you're going to be like, okay, guess I'm clearing. It's, you know, it does its job. But it's not particularly good at doing that. It's certainly a lot worse than Tree of Knowledge. Also, this thing is pretty fucking awful in the early game. can be played with Exarch, but pardon me. But besides that, it is quite bad, and generally would stay away from it. So I was saying, I guess it does do decent damage on level 7. You have the right sort of frontline tanky setup for it. But again, then you run into the problem where it's absolute dog shit on level 10. It just doesn't help on 10 at all. So, and, you know, going back to when I was talking about cannon, if you take the gold on 7, kind of need to pay it forward on 10. And like, I'm talking about how cannon is not the best on 10, let alone fucking Hellraiser. So definitely don't use this unit often, but sometimes it'll do alright. Next up, we've got Marth. I would say Marth is just a pretty good definition of an average unit. It's like okay. If you have good ranged adds for it, like a ranged tier 1 or infantry or spider, it's like pretty fine. Otherwise it's like pretty meh, but you can play it by itself and it does okay. I'm generally not that excited by malformation. It's definitely gone down in my estimation since the last tier list. Honestly, I'm not exactly sure why that is. Possibly because level 4 sends exist, which Marth is not very good at dealing with. Possibly because there are more level 2 sends now that spirits exist, which Marth is not very good at dealing with. And I guess a lot of it is because when it felt fine to be 2-0 on level 3 with a push lane, Marth was pretty safe on the first 3 levels. Now it doesn't feel fine doing that, so you start 3-0 and Marth is really fucking vulnerable on 2 and 3 when you're starting 3-0 with it, so you can get pretty heavily punished by the early sends, which definitely drops it in my estimation. But it's still pretty good at pushing for you, so it's still a reasonable unit. Which is, yeah, as I said, sort of feels like the definition of average. Right, next up we got Meatwagon. I like Meatwagon, but it's not that good. I would say it is a little bit worse than Engineer, just because it doesn't really recover by itself like Engineer does. It is nice as like a mix. Build one Meatwagon with a lot of units somewhat commonly, but it's not particularly strong by itself. It's, you know, it doesn't really do that much. It's okay for sure, but I'm not that excited by this unit, and I think it's just a little bit worse than average. Right, next up we've got Captain. Because he was buffed to have 180 range, he doesn't immediately run in front and die anymore. I mean, he kind of still does a little bit, but he behaves much nicer, so he's just like a pretty decent unit. Scales really well, of course, into the mid game. Generally pretty low impact in the early game, but of course he does one-shot level 3, which can make him a reasonable add on level 3 if you don't have things that are noticeably better. So yeah, Captain is okay. Right, next up we have the Greed Wolf, who is obviously going in Cantbreak tier. No, Raider is staying in below average, so a lot more playable after the changes. Raider got significantly better, and it is playable as its own unit. You can try and use it in an overbuild, but it's weird because like you want to tank for the Raider. I don't know. I'm not sold on this unit, but its highs are very high, its lows are very low. I think generally I would say it's a little bit below average. Some setups, like if you can play it effectively as a carry and you get those early grade procs to accelerate you into wisps, can do very nicely for you. It's definitely significantly improved after the changes, so I appreciate that for sure. The greed is definitely the jankiest of the 3 upgrades though, which is fun though. Greed is just a lot of fun. Alright, next up we have Watcher. To no one's surprise, Watcher is going in the hooted tier. So, Watcher fucking sucks. Unfortunately, there is. You can play it by itself, like you can, and it fucking sucks. You can try and use it as an ad to do damage on like level 15 or something, and it fucking sucks. You can do it, it's just really bad. Watcher can do a few things, it's just incredibly bad at doing all of those things, so this unit just, it sucks. It's so bad. So yeah, sorry Watcher, as far as I'm concerned, not only are you the worst unit in the game, you are a tier worse than everything else. Right, next up we have Harpy. So Harpy is pretty good on the boss levels, and pretty decent on 15, and pretty bad everywhere else. So kinda just below average, and sometimes will be better. Really want to stay away from Harpy in the first like 9 levels though, because I mean it just has the Warcraft 3 damage poison AI, right? Which is where, hey, whatever I just hit is already poison, I'm gonna do more overall damage by shooting something else. Which, like, yes, it's more overall damage, but you're not actually killing anything. So it's really quite awkward to mix with anything. It tends to just be completely useless early game, because damage is irrelevant if you don't actually kill the creep. You don't get the gold if you don't kill the creep. So it's not really good to like a bunch of creeps on half HP instead of like a small number of creeps on full HP, and Harpy tends to give you the first outcome, which is not what you want. But the poison for the debuff is really good on the boss levels, and pretty good on like 15, where Harpy does decent damage as well. So the unit is definitely not crap, you just have to be very careful of the fact that it is bad for a lot of levels in the early game, and that absolutely hurts its rating. Right, next up we have Turret. So Turret is just going to go in the average tier. I think similar to Mouth, it's a pretty good YOLO. It's not that good, but it's pretty good. I feel like there's not much to say about Turret, you know? It's just a lot worse than Akron Archer, but it kind of functions. You generally can get 6-2-ish on level 5, and can generally get to 7-4 and not completely die on 8. So that's pretty good. But yeah, it's definitely not the most exciting unit. So I guess a big part of the weakness, or a big weakness of Turret between Akron and EA, is the level 6. So if you go straight into the 7-3 with Turret on level 6 and have sort of, let's say 600 value, you're probably going to leak a lot. Generally need closer to 700 value with the Turret for level 6, which slows down the push, makes it feel a lot worse than these guys. Also, Turret is like pretty vulnerable level 1, a lot more vulnerable than these guys on level 4 as well. So it's just another couple of things to take away from it, but it's pretty good. I don't really want to put it up 1 tier, but I don't think it's unreasonable to either. Next up we have Guard. I love Guard, but Guard is pretty bad. Sometimes I'm relatively okay with building 1 Guard to have a frontline and a mix YOLO, but for the most part I'm going to stay away from it. Not a lot to say about Guard, it is not a very good unit, unfortunately. Right, moving on we have Sniper. So in terms of the good pierce damage, Sniper is probably the best. So it's going to end up in this tier. So some people would think about putting Sniper in this tier. I think that's a little bit too much of a stretch, because it doesn't work very well in a push lane. It generally is, it's one of those weird units, because it feels like it's not that good until you overbuild early game, until you overbuild with it, and it's really good. So feels a little bit weird, but honestly, it's not the strongest overbuild early game either. You tend to be a little bit lower push to get similar results than a lot of other units, but it does have the upside of, firstly, it's very good on level 10 because it's just like a pierce damage ranged unit. Of course, it's pretty good on 10. And then, holy shit, in the mid game, you upgrade it, put the range buff on itself, and then it just shoots the Kraken and the Fire Lord on 15 and ignores the Centaurs. So yeah, that's pretty strong. And it just seems to do like pretty okay on 14 as well. So yeah, this unit is really good. You play it with Frontline, you play it with Dwarf Tier 2, Slave, you can play it with Clock, play it with like Lord, Ship, Exarch, a whole bunch of these sort of frontliner units. And you can sort of take over games with it, so I'd say this unit is really fucking good. So yeah, don't sleep on Sniper, but make sure you know what you're doing with it in the mid game, because you know, if you're just spamming a bunch of unupgraded ones or upgrading it and not using the range buff on itself, it'd be like, why the fuck is this unit so bad? So yeah, mid game, range buff itself, I think generally it's 12% crit. I think off the top of my head it's 12 or 20% crit is sort of where the magic mix is at in terms of attack speed versus crit to get nice DPS from it. So yeah, bloody good unit. Right, Gate Guard, basically same tier as Raider. The changes made it a lot more usable, but still has the same weaknesses of basically it's dog shit on 5. But yeah, it got a lot better early, so you get more push with it early game, and it's still good at what it used to be good at. Still sort of relatively tanky, has the summon for an extra unit. Pretty solid unit. Little bit worse than average, mainly because of that level 5 being such a weakness, but you know, it can work reasonably well. Sniping the Sens is always a little dangerous, but we haven't seen a mass Gate Guard meta yet, and I hope to God we don't. But yeah, for now it's just feel okay about Gate Guard. It's, as I said, a little bit below average, but the unit is no longer bad, so that's pretty good. Right, next up, Trove Travel. Slow Aura, OP. Slow Aura is really, really good. So Trove Travel goes in this second to top tier. And I'm not actually going to talk about it a lot now. I will get to Polar, and then we'll sort of compare the two, and I'll talk about it a little more then. But I will say I've come to like the unupgraded Trove Travel Aura a lot more than I used to. With basically any sort of primarily melee setup, I'm starting to value this just 130 gold movement speed a lot more than I used to. So Tier 2 gets a slight little upgrade in my mind since last tier list. So it could be because I've come to like that aura quite a bit more. Anyway, next up is going to be Medicine Man. So basically going to end up in this tier. So keeping in mind, tier list focusing from level 1 to level 21. So we're not talking about the Oracle Jank on 31 and the true endgame. So we're basically talking about, do you ever really want a Medicine Man early? I would say not really. Do you ever really want an Oracle in the mid game? I would say very, very rarely. I have like a very tanky frontline setup and I can hit a lot of them with the Oracle buff, I'm like, sure. But that's pretty rare. Sometimes it's okay, but pretty rare. Generally say Oracle is fairly weak until you get to the actual endgame. So yeah, pretty underwhelming unit. Right, next up we've got the Apprentice / Blacksmith. I'm gonna pop this unit in the average tier. It's a little bit difficult to rate, but I do think Blacksmith is fairly solid. Can definitely get a bit of a better use case for it if you've got sort of those expensive carry units. Again, things like Griffin, Doomsday spring to mind that it can buff. But just as like a unit that has a siege damage attack and then summons a turret with pierce damage, it's pretty good. Like it's pretty fine. It's not super exciting, but I think the unit is pretty decent overall. So yeah, gonna pop it in the sort of average tier. Honestly, now I'm thinking about it, I almost feel like this should be above average and this should be average, but we're not going to change that now. I'm happy with where we are. Okay, next up, the Drunk Pirate. So after the changes to True Pirate, now having the double attack, definitely got noticeably better. Also, the Drunk Pirate got buffed the spell does a bit more damage, so it holds level 1 by itself, which is pretty nice for sure. Barely, barely holds level 1 by itself, but does. So yeah, this unit just ended up as pretty solid. You can do an overbuild with True Pirate when you actually ignite the sabers. It's pretty decent on like 5, 7, 10. Drunk Pirate again, as I just said, got better in the early game, so it's a bit easier to get to that True Pirate. Feels like less of a liability. Unit's pretty solid. No major complaints. It's squishy, melee, so the aura from the True Pirate tends to not last that long. Tends to sort of run a bit further in front than you might like it to and die kind of quickly, but the unit is pretty decent overall. Does need dudes in front of it though, so definitely don't make the mistake of thinking this guy is a frontliner, because he is not. Does not appreciate the front line. Next up, Young Witch Doctor. I love Witch Doctor. I think it is extremely strong. I think the regen aura is just like always good, because it works on expensive tanky units really nicely because they take a long time to die. It works with like a large number of smaller units because they all take a bit of damage and you're getting a lot of effective HP. Witch Doctor himself has a pretty nice increment, 2-shotting level 4 specifically. Feels really, really good. So just, this unit is so good. You just spend 100 gold and it feels like you should cost more with almost every setup. It's just, yeah, he's very, very, very good. Worth noting specifically, a little weaker on level 10. I see sometimes people build this guy for level 10 and it's like, well, realistically all the damage is focused onto 3 targets, so kind of only getting value from those 3 targets, and very unlikely that the regen is going to change an increment from a boss hit, so not the best on 10. The upgrade I generally value fairly, or I generally don't value the upgrade that much, even in the mid-game. Towards the end game for sure, but mid-game generally don't value the upgrade that much unless I specifically do have a very bulky setup. Things like Hydras, Berserkers, Butchers, I'm pretty happy to get it, otherwise I'll generally just shy away from the upgrade. And yeah, this rating is mostly based off the 100 gold unupgraded version rather than the upgrade. Alright, next up we have Mudman. I want to put Mudman here, but as one of the guys asked for feedback, Clickz I think, mentioned that Golem Tok is a build, so, and it is, so it kinda gets here. I think Mudman is pretty bad. He's good on 3, that's about it. Spirits existing make him a lot worse. But sometimes you can, I mean, Mudman is good on 3 and Golem is good on 6. Beyond that, they're pretty bad. Yeah. He's not a great unit, but he does his thing. Actually, you know what? I'm gonna actually shift both of these guys here. Golem has that one niche, but besides that, I think he is basically always garbage, and I think this guy is basically always garbage. I think that's a bit of a fairer reflection now I'm looking at the tier list as a whole. Yeah, I'd say that's reasonable. I have to fight Clickz for it later, but that's alright. I don't rate the Mudman. I dislike this unit. I really don't think it's good. Possible I'm underrating it, but I think this unit is... I think I would basically always stay away from it. Alright, next up we have Outcast. Outcast is difficult to rate and awkward. Sometimes you can make him work. I would say most of the time it's not worth trying to make him work. This janky positioning thing. But, you know, you can do it. You can do it. You can just, you know, use a bunch of unupgraded outcasts for 14 and they're kind of okay. But they're going to be kind of worse than the actual things that are going to be, or they're basically a lot of things that are pretty similar on paper, but just do it better. So, he's alright, but don't get too excited. Right, Priest. Gonna go in the same tier as the other heal guy. I'd say Priest is better than Medicine Man, obviously at healing. Sometimes the Oracle is useful, which kind of is why they end up in the same tier, and why the Medicine Man isn't here. But for the most part, I would stay away from priest, but if you do have that like tanky unit, like say a butcher, then the priest can be pretty good. So it's definitely not a crap unit by any stretch. But generally I'd say it's a fairly low impact unit, so don't see a whole lot of use for priest a lot of the time, but he's okay. Next up, Troll Champion, the Aura. He is generally too expensive and too low impact as like a fighting unit himself. Like the Axe Thrower Troll Champion, in terms of hitting things, is pretty bad. The Aura is quite good. Generally the Aura is a bit too expensive to justify in the early game, considering the tower itself is quite bad. But the Aura is very good come the mid to late game, so I'm basically always pretty happy to see this guy for the Aura, but I generally won't build him before level 10. Generally the first time I make this guy is Arena. So yeah. I guess it is worth saying that one-shotting level 3 and he's like okay on 8. So sometimes if I have an awkward lane, I might do that, but that would be quite rare. Alright, next up we have Tempest. So Tempest, I guess it's like similar to Outcast, where it's an okay quote-unquote option for anti-17. You can also play Tempest early, but it's actually pretty good on the first 4 levels. It is very, very, very bad on 5 and 8, and it's good again on 6. Very bad on 5 and 8 though, so it's difficult to justify using it. And it's not like it's that insane on the first 3 levels, right? It's not like, oh, I can get to early 5-1 for level 3 because I have Tempest in my role. It's like, no, it's not fucking Engineer, as much as you may wish it was. It's just, you know, it's just pretty fine on those first few levels, and then really bad on 5. In terms of 17, Leviathan is okay with if you have auras and support for it, but I would say it's generally worse than like, well, I mean, it basically is generally worse than things like Cannon and Neotank. It's just worth keeping in mind that it can be used for that. So, you know, it's okay, but in terms of anti-17, a lot of the other anti-17 range siege damage will be better. In terms of early game, I don't use this. A couple people do, but it's definitely not the most impactful unit. It's just sometimes it might make your lane a little bit better if you can support it on 5. Alright, next up we've got Polar. So he's going to end up in the same tier as Trove Travel. So now it's time to sort of compare the two. In terms of the unupgraded variants, Trove Travel has the niche of the Speed Aura, which is pretty good in mid game. Polar has the Slow Aura to start with, which basically makes the 130 gold fighting body early game. The Polar is better, right? With the exception of level 4 and level 8, where the Speed Aura is actually really impactful. The Polar's a lot better. And the Polar has the niche of being like generally quite a good unit on 5, again because of the slow. Flying units grouping up a lot more, the Slow Aura is very valuable on 5. But now we're talking about the upgrades. So this is basically a case of, for me, the upgraded TOT Aura is a lot better than the upgraded Magnetor Aura. So the difference between the two is the Magnetor Aura does a bigger percentage slow in a smaller area. TOT does a smaller percentage slow in a bigger area. I think the TOT is a lot better. I value the range on that a lot. I feel like it starts to affect the sends and affect bosses a lot earlier, to the point where they get stuck fairly often, which I place a great deal of value on. In terms of the Magnetor Aura is still good against the creeps, I just value it a little bit less. In terms of the actual like fighting body, there is no debate that the Magnetor is significantly better. Magnetor is alright, it's just you build a bunch of them and they're okay on 17. He's also almost a YOLO in himself, in the sense that Magnetor is one-shotting 5 and 6. So you build a Polar early, build whatever you need to hold level 4, upgrade him to a Magnetor on 5, you hold 5 and 6, and it's like, you're kind of done. So yeah, both very, very good units. They are different in terms of what their strengths are. but both very, very, very good. I personally prefer TOT a little bit more. Initially I had them ranked like this, but realistically that is a little bit unfair to Polar. And I was sort of trying to make the distinction that I personally feel like TOT is a little bit better. It really isn't a whole tier better than Polar, if it is indeed better at all, because that is just, that is more my opinion there. Yeah, both very, very good units. Okay, next up we have Mermaid. Mermaid is just, it's not always going to be good in the early, but with bigger units, it can be okay. It's definitely like, as an actual fighting unit, it's pretty shit. So I would, there's not a hell of a lot of use for it in the first 9 levels, unless you've got that very tanky sort of setup. So things like 3 Ig plus Highborn is quite good on 7, for example. But beyond that, generally I try and not use Mermaid too much for the first sort of 8 levels, 8, 9 levels. And it is quite good on level 10, because the slow on the bosses is quite valuable. Then in the mid game, you upgrade it to a Highborn. It becomes a health regen aura with the extra shield, and yeah, it's just, I mean, look at Witchdog. It's really good, the aura is good. Basically the reason it's not in the same tier as Witchdog is because you have to pay 300 gold to get that aura, and it's a little bit worse of a fighting unit. But yeah, that's the only reason it's not in the excellent tier, and that it's like it's only strong. But yeah, Mermaid is very solid, so don't get too keen to build it early, but definitely don't sleep on it. Right, next up is Overseer. That's what this is called, right? I think so. Anyway, Overseer just has its sort of niche use. If you have it like a full melee setup, it's pretty good. You very rarely have that, so it's generally pretty bad. But yeah, I value the lifesteal not very much, which sounds weird considering how much I value regen. Yeah, that does sound weird actually. It's possible I underrate this slightly, but it does only work with melee setup, so I'm not too sold on it. God awful as a fighting unit, so I don't get too excited about it, but it is okay in some setups. Some setups it's probably even pretty good, and in a lot it's pretty not good. Right, next up we've got the Void Dragon. So this is going to just end up in the same tier, where it's okay on 5, 7, 13. Beyond that it's pretty bad. It's really not very good on 10, so generally just avoid this unit. But sometimes if you need that anti-5, like with Engineers or Meatwagon, you can play it. Or if you, like, someone needs to do some damage on 7, you can use this unit, but I would very rarely use it. Very, very rarely. I think the unit is quite bad overall. Right, next up we have Prisoner. So Prisoner's gonna go in the sort of like meh tier. I guess if I had to say this, it's like, I dislike Prisoner. I think the unit is pretty bad overall. I think I dislike it a little bit more than is probably fair. But I do not like the RNG of the Maverick split. I don't find that Maverick is very good mid-game at all. It feels like it could be. I mean, chaos damage is one of those things that you got to be careful with as a map maker, and I'm sure that Brad and Kappa know this a hell of a lot better than me. But if you give something chaos damage and give it good stats, then it's just the best thing for every level. But it just feels like Maverick is a little bit too weak on every level instead. So I'm sure there's a point somewhere where it's balanced. I feel like it's just on the side of, yeah, this unit is kind of bad. It doesn't push that fast. It has a terrible increment on 2, which is fixed by Ice Troll and Parasite, and that's about it. And then with the split, like, sometimes your Maverick ends up sitting on top of the wall on level 5 and you can hold with like 590 value and it's pretty good. And sometimes your Maverick ends up teleporting into the middle of the wave and you'll leak with 650 value and it fucking sucks. So, you know, good luck. But yeah, I feel like the only sort of quote-unquote comfortable way to play a prisoner is 2 Mavericks on 5, and considering that you need some kind of ad to actually reach that build, you end up with way too much value to make it an acceptable YOLO, considering that the unit has really no carry potential. So yeah, boo, bad unit. Next up we have Necromancer. So Necromancer is one of those units, I'm gonna put it here. It could go 1 tier up, just generally, but I'm gonna put it in this tier. So Necrolite and Ghost. Necrolite is one of the weaker pierce damage dealers for 7, but it can work. But it is quite good for level 10. Ghost is one of those units that very rarely skip it in the mid game, but it's definitely, Ghost is just like not really usable early on. You can build a Ghost on 10 and it's okay. I would say for most setups on that are actually looking to hold 10, the Necrolite is better. If you're looking to just be like 7-4, 7-5, do some damage, the Ghost is pretty good because it'll just drain the bosses of a few hundred HP. But yeah, obviously in the mid game, Ghost is one of the best units, but I think because the Necromancer has a relatively weak early game, and the Necrolite is not particularly good in the mid game, and only the Ghost is, that I would just pop it in this tier. It is a very good unit, and it's one of those things that, like, who are only talking about mid game, then it's here because one Ghost is like the best unit ever. But because early game is such a big deal, and the Necromancer sort of, it takes a unit slot and doesn't pay it back sort of until level 10, and even then it obviously does need other help to do it. So the unit is solid, definitely a strong unit, but a little less splashable than most of these other units. The reason it ends up in this tier is simply because the Ghost is so strong. Okay, next up we have Flying Machine. So I'll admit I initially had Helicopter here because I love Helicopter, but people reminded me that it doesn't actually work with melee. Even though I think, I don't know, I still low-key kind of think Helicopter is insane because it's a good fighting unit. Realistically, this is probably the fairest tier for it. If you have full ranged, it's definitely here. If you don't, it's obviously probably like here, or even here if you don't have full ranged. Or if you don't have any ranged, but yeah. Helicopter is quite good. Flying Machine. I actually got feedback that Flying Machine is a pretty bad unit early, and I disagree. Flying Machine is pretty bad on level 3. Even then it's not that bad on level 3. Because the thing about Flying Machine is it 1-shots level 2, which is nice. It 2-shots level 3. It's definitely a little fragile on level 3, but it does 2-shot. And it 2-shots 4. And then I don't quite remember, I believe it 2-shots 5 as well. So I'm not sure where the feedback was that it's such a bad unit early. It's definitely a little fragile. It's not the best unit early, but I don't think it's garbage as a fighting unit. And I would say Helicopter is pretty good as just a fighting unit. It's not amazing for sure, but 300 gold and at 1-shots level 5, 2-shots level 8. Generally not too upset to have the Helicopter. Yeah, the main thing is just the damage aura. So ranged units are generally superior to melee units in terms of damage dealers. So it's like you're buffing your damage dealers to do more damage. That's definitely sort of what you're looking for, those force multiplying effects. So like healing, armor, regen being best for your tanks, rather than making your tanks do damage. Make your tanks tankier, then make your damage dealers do more damage. And Helicopter is one of the best things at doing that, while also not being a liability as just like a little, you know, a little guy that shoots. Compared to say something like Troll Champion, which is pretty bad as a little guy that shoots. Right, next up we've got Grizzly. It's just going to end up in like, Grizzly doesn't really do anything well except level 6 unless your name is Root. You can play it early and it sort of gets you through the level 4, 5, 6, but it's pretty vulnerable to all the sends and it's god-awful on 8. Then proceeds to not really be good on any level in the mid-game, including 17. It feels like it should be good 17, but at least from what I've seen, it just kind of doesn't really function very well. So I generally consider this unit pretty weak, but sometimes if I don't have much else, I know I can get away with a Grizzly into Greymane YOLO. And sometimes if I have nothing else for 17, I'll build them, but never going to be too happy about it. Next up, Cyborg. So Cyborg doesn't have the fact that it's like usable early game compared to Grizzly, but it is actually good on 14. So yeah, there's that, I guess. It's kind of the same deal otherwise. It's not the best. On the most levels, it's pretty solid 14. Pretty shithouse early. Not a great unit, but if you are looking for anti-14 and you roll into Cyborg, I actually would not be sad about that most of the time. So yeah. Besides that though, it's just too weak on too many levels. Right. Next up we have Ship. So Ship's gonna end up in the average tier, but Ship is a little bit difficult to rate because when you have good damage dealing adds, particularly ones with long range such as Sniper that will stay behind the ship, it's like, yeah, Ship is really good. When you don't have that, it's like, wow, Ship fucking sucks. So it's a little bit difficult to rate. I'd say that there are enough ranged units in the game I'm happy enough to mix Ship with, to the point where I'm happy to say, yeah, it's for the most part like average to maybe a little bit above. But definitely there are some use cases where it's just Ship is really bad to the point of just borderline unplayable. Because it doesn't do enough damage to get you through level 5 without the ads it relies on. But when you have those ads, it feels very good. Also, decent mid-game. Decent as sort of a frontliner. A little bit of damage for 17. And a little bit of RNG to sometimes just pull the sends and hold when you may not deserve to. Also fairly solid on both boss levels 10 and 20, so it gets a little bit of a increase from me there. Right, next up we have Knight. I think Knight, Cavalier after the buffs is probably just like the best dumb anti-14 tank with the exception of Berserker. And I guess Berserker and Butcher, but neither of them really feel like dumb tanks, I guess. I don't know, maybe they're like classic dumb anti-14 tank, it's fair to call it. Cavalier also got a lot better on level 7 if you want to use it there. Definitely not an overpowered unit by any stretch, but I think it's just become, instead of pretty bad at everything, it's now like pretty good at a few things, and then not super exciting beyond that. Unupgraded Knight still has the same problems as it always did, which is it's squishy, it's fast, and it dies immediately on 5 with a shitty damage increment on 4. So definitely be careful with unupgraded Knight, and don't go thinking that because this unit is in a decent tier, now I can just spam Knights. Fuck no, Knights are terrible, Cavaliers are pretty solid. So yeah. Next up is Nightmare. It's like a playable YOLO with some ads, but not that many of them. And generally you can just find a better unit than Nightmare. But if you can't, you can play Nightmare and kind of make it work. So yeah. Alright, Druid. Druid is going in the, because I have to scroll up, I should probably use my mouse. Druid is going to go in the this tier here, generally quite strong, situationally excellent. So Ascendant is really fucking good. I think it's the best armor reduction unit because it has good range, stays at the back, good armor reduction, and just like does a lot of damage. It is kind of expensive, but it feels like you get more than what you pay for with one Ascendant. Druid itself is quite bad in the early game, but it is, I'm not sure if I want to call it, no, it is the best anti-20. In terms of just dealing damage, Druid is the best spammable anti-20. The reason I wanted to say spammable, because like I guess Ghost does more damage per gold overall. But, you know, it's kind of Ghost doing its thing. And then, yeah, the Sword Mage, the Master of Elements, is quite strong on 17, 18 as well. So I'd say Druid is a pretty good unit. It's not always good, besides one Ascendant, but sometimes like Druid or Master of Elements will also be very good. Then yeah, Druid, as you go like 20, 21 and past that as well, even though we're not talking about past that for the generally, just unupgraded Druid starts to do like a pretty solid amount of damage. So yeah, don't sleep on this unit. He is pretty good, but pretty bad in the early stages. Alright, next up is Half-Breed / Goliath. I'm going to put him at just a little bit below average. So basically terrible early game, not really usable, doesn't do enough and is expensive. He's good on 17 and he's good in some tanky setups for the mid game, but generally I would say his aura is a little bit too expensive for 15, which basically means it's probably a little bit too expensive for 14 most of the time as well. Then bad on 16, very good on 17 because the aura and, you know, the smacks do well. Like okay in tanky setups on 18, and it's okay in tanky setups on 20 if to have like one of them. This unit is definitely, it's not that great, but it would feel I would feel remiss to put it on the same tier as something like Grizzly or Outcast, because I definitely do think it is better than pardon me, better than those. And next up we have Monk. Monk is oh, by the way, just ignore these here, they're like just placeholders from before I had the dwarf icons, and turns out I couldn't actually delete them, or I couldn't figure out how to, so you're stuck with them, sorry. Anyway, Monk is very good. So we're going to end up in this tier, mostly because we're a little bit awkward on level 3. We're not the best early game unit in general. It's okay for 7. I personally hate massing monks for 7. Sometimes I think it can make sense to do like 3 monks with some damage behind. Mostly because you can transition that well into 10, where Berserker, the upgraded monk, is relatively good. And it's also very, very, very good in the mid-game. Yeah. This rating is honestly mostly about Berserker on 10 and in the mid-game. But the unupgraded monk itself is, while it has a couple of weaknesses, it's certainly not a liability of a unit. So yeah, it's just a unit you can play early that will function as a frontline sort of tank. You can definitely put damage behind it and be very successful with that, and then it will scale actually extremely well into mid-game, which is why we've ended up with Berserker on a good tier. Potentially could go a little bit higher, but I think the unit is a little bit too vulnerable on level 1, level 3, and not good enough on level 7 to justify going any higher. That being, and also we're saying like the Berserker is pretty good, or like is a good frontliner in the mid game, but with the exception of 14 and I guess 18, it's really not any more than just a dumb frontliner that just survives a bit longer than it deserves to. But if that's what you need in the mid game, then it does that very well. Right, next up we have Komodo. So Komodo is just going to end up in that slightly below average tier. You can definitely play this unit early game as a YOLO, and it's not that bad at doing it. You can sometimes overbuild with it if you really feel the need to, upgrading it to Trident. I would generally not do that personally. You can like pretend it's anti-14 and it's kind of anti-14. Say that most of the time this unit fits the definition of just like, it's below average, but it's definitely usable. And you know, you can get an okay push going with Komodo without feeling too bad about it. But beyond that, it's not particularly good. Right, next up is Apparition. So Apparition it's one of those units that if this tier list was talking about the end stages of the game, Apparition gets a lot better, because it's not. Apparition is a lot worse. Unfortunately, it's just the percentage damage reduction doesn't mean that much in the, or means absolutely fuck all in the early game, considering how bad of a just fighting unit Apparition is. And it's not really meaning enough in the mid game. This guy is okay, or this guy is like pretty worth building on 20. Sometimes in tanky setups, I might feel okay about building him for like 17, 18. Sometimes if I just need pierce damage, I might build one on 10. But beyond that, it's really not that great. Alright, next up is Harlot. Harlot is good at level 7, Harlot is fucking awful at everything else. So if you desperately need help on level 7, you can build Harlots, but oh my god, I would I hope not many people do that very often, because I feel like there is so rarely a justification for actually building a lot of Harlots for level 7. The exception, because the issue with doing it, right, is like the time I would like to do that is when I have like Thornmail and I lose 2 heals early. But then it's like something chaotic has already happened, so I probably already have like push and already like not Harlots. So am I actually going to hold level 7 even if I start building Harlots from there? I feel like a lot of the time the answer is probably not. But if the heals happen early, like level 2, level 3, then maybe. So yeah, it's one of those things you can think about, but pretty bad unit. Don't even talk about the upgrade. The Mistress, it just... very RNG, and the spell, because it curses enemy units in a somewhat small area, and then they get more attack speed, so sometimes you'll just take more damage. Overall, you should take less, but I'm not a big fan of the RNG like that. Then you're paying 180 gold for like essentially a Harlot, but kind of worse. As a fighting body, it's just garbage, so I'd stay away from that. Right, next up we have Time Stealers. This is a unit that I rated, I think, here initially, and from the feedback was one of the units that I did bring down. Because when Time Stealer is good, so behind Dwarf Tier 2, behind Servant, it can just feel like you are uncontestable in the early game. And it's very, very strong, because Time Stealer is an excellent damage dealer, one of the best damage dealers. 4, 5, 6, 7, it's insanely good. It's pretty solid on 10, because it steals the attack speed from the boss, does a decent amount of damage. It's a hell of a lot of damage if it gets time to ramp up. The upgraded Time Stealer, not bad on level 10 for the debuff, has a decent niche there. So 2 reasons why the Time Stealer moved down. First reason is pretty bad in the mid game. Even level 15, where it like should be good, it still ends up being relatively bad. It's okay on 20, and it's actually quite good on 13, which is a bit weird, but it is. Beyond that, it's pretty bad on basically all the other mid game levels. So you do have to be careful if you're looking to set up like an early game carry with Time Stealers, that you do actually fall off in the mid game, so you kind of need either a way around that with either different units, one of your teammates being strong, or just ending the game early. So it's one of those units that like feel like if your carry the Time Stealer lanes, you're trying to build enough of an advantage from your early game strength to just win in the mid game, despite the fact your lanes have fallen off. The other reason that the Time Stealer moved down is, quite frankly, like 80% of the time you roll this unit, you don't have frontliney set up to make it work, and you just don't build it. Because if you don't have those ads to make it work, it's far too vulnerable on level 1. And then the issue is, with Time Stealer, you can often either choose to be good level 2 or good level 3. So if you full build level 2, you'll generally be okay. But if you don't reach the second Time Stealer for 3, it feels like shit. Unless you're adding other good units, and if you have other good units to add, then play those other good units and build Time Stealers later, and you'll just have more success that way. So starting Time Stealer is basically just going to be something you look to avoid. Unit is good. Alright, Disciple. This may not surprise many people, but it is going to be the first addition to the Cantbreak tier. This is literally just because it pushes better than Akron Archer, and that's just what it does. This unit is so strong in the early. It is a lot more balanced than it used to be. after the nerf, and the fact that it is very, very, very vulnerable to Murgle, but it's just so incredibly strong. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, fine on 6, decent on 8, incredibly strong on 9. Falls off a little bit in the mid game, but this is the best unit to push within the early game. I think hands down. It's got a lot of good mixes. With some of those mixes you can look to even set up a carry with it with a 1 disciple push into getting ridiculously fat because you get a ridiculous amount of push into looking for a carry. You're consistently 7-2 on level 5, which is just kind of crazy. So yeah, bloody good unit. Oh, and also if you think like a straight 5 send is coming with not Murgles, so like Blood Orcs and Verbs and shit, you can just build 3 disciples and kill all the birds with like 620 value and 6-1 and then go 7-3, and it's pretty good. So yeah, disciple. It is the best pushing unit in the game, in my opinion. Alright, zombie. Zombie is, I actually had it rated here, but after feedback I did move that one down. Main reason being, like, zombie is, well, butcher is really good, coming like 10 and in the mid game. Zombie is quite vulnerable early. It's bad on 1. It's good on 2, but if it gets scouted on 2, as was pointed out by a number of people, very, very, very fragile against resend 4 and 5 without specific adds, and a lot of overbuild, and even then it's generally just not going to be that good on those levels anyway. It's a little bit vulnerable on 3. As I said, crap on 4 and 5. It's like whatever on 6. Butcher is very vulnerable on 7. To Kobold specifically, or just like Ferment Whelp, and it doesn't do enough damage. It's good on 10 and it's good in the mid game. So it's definitely a very strong unit, but doesn't quite justify itself being in this tier. Okay, next up we have the Alchemist. So Alchemist Blaster, I actually don't mind this unit. I think it is pretty good 14. I think it's actually not that bad, like 15 and 17, 18 as a frontliner either. But it's pretty bloody shit in the early game. Because if you think about, like, what are Alchemist's good levels? It's bad versus Warriors level 1. It's not that good level 2 now versus Spirits. A lot of time, like, you won't even be mid, because Alchemist 2-shots level 2, so it actually takes a while to get through the creeps, and Spirits do a lot of damage. So if you don't have actually, like, good focus, fair shot, you're either leaking or barely mid. It's not that good level 3, because you have to save a bunch of gold to get the Blaster on 4. Pretty good versus Send on 4, but not that good. You'll have like a low HP Blaster in mid. Fucking sucks on 5. Pretty good on 6. Sucks on 7. It's like pretty bad on 10. So it's just such a... Blech. This unit's just not good in the early game. And then it's not that good in the mid game either. It's like good on 14, good on 12. And I gave it benefit of the doubt. I think it's like okay on 15, 17, 18. But it's really not that great. It's somewhat generous to even put it in this tier, I think. But the main reason I did is, as I said, I think it's pretty good on 14. And I think 14 is more important than it used to be. Since the introduction of like Behemoth on 14 and Maiden on 14. And Nerubian as well. I think that Blaster, you know, gets a little bit of a buff from that. Alright, next up we've got Wendigo. I basically consider it like worse Blaster. Wendigo's a bit more playable in the early game, but since it is so bad level 5, it's a bit difficult to justify using it in the early game. You tend to need a lot of overbuild level 5. If you're overbuilding 5, you tend to want to overbuild 7 and then 10. Wendigo is not particularly good at doing either of those things. It can, but it's not very good at it. So I would generally avoid this unit. And to me it's like the same things I just said about Blaster apply to Wendigo to some extent. I think Wendigo is worse, like to the point of being pretty bad on like 15, say. And I would consider it worse than Blaster on like 12 and 14 as well. So I don't love this unit, but it is okay. It is usable. Alright, next up we've got Wyvern. I'm trying to remember where I put Wyvern. Yeah, I put Wyvern here, but... no, I think that's fair. Wyvern is reasonable on 10. And that's about it. Like, the Wind Rider is pretty good. There's some mix YOLOs on 8. You generally need a bit of a fatter game to afford that. 7-4. The Wyvern itself is just far too vulnerable in the early game. Bad increment on 4. Terrible on 3. Terrible on 3. And then just fragile on 1 and 2. So I would really never play Wyvern early, which kind of gets rid of Wind Rider on 5 as an option for me, almost completely. And then it just doesn't really do anything that's very good past that. Like, sometimes you'll build a few Wyverns for 10, and it's okay. Probably, like, I mean, it is definitely competing among the worst pierce damage ranged units. So you can see there are 3 of them down here, and all the rest are higher up somewhere, where they should be. Alright, next up we have Warden. Unfortunately, Warden is basically always garbage. You can play it with Dark Mage and, like, it's cool. It's really cool. But it's not really good. And then just... it's like, how do you play this unit? Because it's not that good in the mid-game. It's not completely awful, but it's not that good in the mid-game. To justify it being even here. Too expensive doesn't do enough. And then, how do you justify paying 300 gold for this early game? Like, if you're building for something for 300 gold, you should be like, yeah, I'm spending 300 gold now to make my game really good. That's true in the case of a unit that is coming up, but it is just not true in the case of Moonguard/Warden. So, sometimes I would play this maybe with Dark Mage if I want fun, but I don't think I would ever play it really if I want to win. So unfortunately, I think this unit is quite bad. Right, speaking of the other 300 gold unit, in a far cry from Warden, LOD will be the second addition to the Cantbreak tier. The reason for this is Hades is one of the best answers for level 10. And level 10 is, I think, the most important level. It's somewhere between fine and good for every mid-game level. You can push with it, you can overbuild with it. It's just, you can do everything. It is a little dependent on the other units in your role to actually be that insane, but it can also be that insane with so many of these units. It's like you have any of these units in like the top 4 tiers with LOD, and LOD just makes them so much better. Like, you can look at all these units and you're like, I would like to play LOD with that unit in my role. Even all of these units, it's like, yes, if I have LOD in my role, I would like these units in my role. It's just so strong. It is so good on so many levels, and it does everything well. The one downside is you start 1-0. That's it. That's the only downside to this unit. Everything else is just fully up and up. So yeah, I'd say if I had to pick a single best unit in the game, like trying to take as many situational setups out of it, I would probably just pick LOD because it's fucking good everywhere. Yeah, it's just good. Alright, next up we have Spawn. So Spawn's a little bit difficult. I'm gonna rate it in here. So basically, early game I would generally just stay away from it. It is playable technically with some ads, but I would generally rather just not. Basically, I'd say the niche of this unit is the melt armor. Changing armor type from whatever it is to unarmored. And I would say that's more or less only useful on 17, stripping the fortified armor, making it unarmored. Occasionally, this thing will like save your level 17 where you just have no siege and you find this, you build like one of them and it actually does a lot of work on 17. Beyond that, it's pretty shit. I'm sorry. But yeah, besides that one niche, it's pretty bad, so I generally avoid it, but sometimes, keep that niche in mind because sometimes it will end up mattering. Right, next up we have Warchief. Warchief is basically like kind of anti-14 but bad at it. That's about it. I don't like Warchief. I would very rarely want to build Warchief. I think I'm never happy building Warchief. So yeah, it's just not a good unit. If I need anti-14, especially if I have a little bit of AoE already, I might build Warchief. That's about it. It's not a very good unit, unfortunately. Not a lot to say about it. Very weak in the early game. Another of those units that doesn't justify the 300 cost. The only reason I've put it above Moonguard is because I do think it is noticeably better in the mid game at what it does, but better than Warden, unfortunately, isn't a big claim to fame. Right, next up we've got the Dragonhawk. So I'm going to put this in the average tier. It's worth noting that, again, because 14 is a relevant level, this does definitely affects the rating of Dragonhawk. The other thing that affects it is the fact that, like, the best case scenario, where you have like Dark Mage and Parasite and Helicopter and Frontline, and you're like, holy shit, Griffin is the best unit in the game, and in that situation it kind of is. And in other situations you have like some archers and like a few other range units and like not really much of a frontline and no real auras, and you're like, wow, Griffin is a fucking liability, and it is. So the difference between like best case Griffin and worst case Griffin is huge. So definitely makes it a lot more difficult to use the unit, or gives it, I guess, a narrower range of situations where it's actually good. When it is good, it's very, very good. When it's bad, it's quite bad. It is quite weak on 14, but that being said, it's not too bad on 10, good on 12, alright on 13, bad on 14 as I said, but sometimes, again, if you have one of them in that like best case scenario, it can actually feel pretty good on 14, because it's still just, with the right support and auras, basically when it's looked after, it still does a shitload of damage. Then it does well on basically every other level besides 17. Alright, next up we have the Pure Darkness. So this thing is like pretty good for 14 and 17. Beyond that, it's pretty bad. I would say this unit is a complete liability in the early game. I'd stay away from it. Yeah, I think it's it's okay. Sometimes if you have like the right support for it, so something to take the attention from the first creeps before you get the summons, and then ideally like a little bit of supporting aura for the summons, so maybe some lifesteal from the Overseer. You have yourself a average of, you know, this is B, it's like average of D tier. I don't know. But PD's alright, but it's pretty niche. I'd say only 14 and 17. The unit are the levels where it's sort of good, and then 20, again, it's pretty good. We'll say 1 PD for the debuff, the minus attack debuff. You can make a case for that, but I don't think it's particularly impactful in the mid game. I generally think this unit is like very bad. For example, on 15, it's one of the worst units. On 16, it's okay 18, it's good 20, it's terrible 21. So, you know, it's one of those things, like, it's good in a few levels, it's bad on most of them. Gotta be careful with it, it's bad on the first 10 levels. But, you know, sometimes it will do work for you. I think most of the time it will end up just being rerolled. Right, next up, Seer of Darkness. So again, remember that this tier list is based on the first 21 levels, and in the first 21 levels, Seer of Darkness is bad. Yeah, that's just really how to say it. It's like okay on 20. You can get like 1 Phoenix and it's okay on 20. So we'll say like this tier list is not fair to a couple of units. By kicking out endgame, Oracle is one of them. Seer of Darkness is probably the other main one. Where like, holy shit, Phoenix is the unit you want, like after sort of 21, but before that, not really. It's like okay on 21, and it's like okay on 20. And besides that, it's pretty damn bad. So I don't think it deserves this tier, but 1 to 21, would for the most part stay away from this unit. Right, next up, Guardian of Death. It's gonna... Unfortunately, the dragons are not having a great time here. I do think Guardian of Death is probably the best dragon. It is the most expensive, but the unupgraded Guardian can do okay on like 14. I like it because it gets helicopter aura, and I love helicopter, so you know, that's like, make of that what you will. The shatter ability I think is okay on 20. And okay on 21 as well. I think it's probably the best dragon for 21. But it's definitely not a particularly good unit. But that being said, it is like kind of usable. Generally for the early game you just can't afford this because it costs 320 gold. First level you can afford it is level 8 and it's bad on 8, so you just don't really see it in the early game. Except for like the occasional bottom feeder, exact Dark Mage, Guardian of Death, but... or bottom feeder, what is it, Dark Mage, Egg Sack, bottom feeder, Polar, any tier 5, Guardian of Death, and then it's like, maybe I can play it. If it's a little bit specific. Right, next up we have Dark Priest, so this actually may surprise some, but I'm gonna only rate Dark Priest in the sort of strong tier. This might look a bit weird, and I could see Dark Priest moving up and I'd be fine with that, but sort of hear me out. So, level 10 Dark Priest is, like, first 9 levels Dark Priest is for the most part not very good. It's like okay on 8, okay on 9, but whatever. Level 10, I think Dark Priest is like, it's alright, but it's not that good. And then 12 it sucks, 13 it sucks, 14 it's pretty bad. It's okay at killing, at like hitting Behemoth. It takes a while to kill it. So I'd say like 14 that's not that good. 15 that's very good. It is very good on 15. Then it's like solid on 16, it's like okay, it's bad on 17, sorry. It's like alright on 18, 19, whatever. It's good on 20, it's like good on 21. So basically it ends up here because it is very good on 15. 15 is important. It is decent on 10. 10 is important. It's like this unit is okay for sure. It's one of those things, it does scale the best into the endgame. Obviously, if this was a 21 to 31 plus tier list, this unit goes here, being one of like the 3 best units for endgame. But I think for the tier list standing 21, this is a fair place to put Dark Priest. Very good on 15, very good on 20, reasonable on 10. Beyond that, not particularly exciting. The main reason it doesn't even get pushed down further is because it is able to kill a lot of the Sens. It can kill like the Warlocks and the Nerubian and the Behemoth on 14 with reasonable consistency, which is definitely strong. But if you're building Dark Priest, you're probably not going to actually be able to hold 14 unless you have good value and a good setup otherwise. So moving on, Hydra. So I think a lot of what I said about Dark Priest also applies to Hydra. The fact that like it's just too much of a liability now in the first 9 levels. You can't start Sea Giant. It's dead on 1, it's dead on 2. It's like can be okay on 3 if you're lucky, or if you're 1-0. It tends to rip on 4. It's like barely okay on 5. It'll leak on 6. It'll probably just leak on 7 if you're trying to overbuild with it. So you just can't use this unit early. It's really very, very difficult to use early and generally just not worth it. You can get one Hydra for 10 and it's like pretty tanky, so that's solid. And then it's good on 15 and then it's tanky, whereas Dark Priest does decent damage and hits Sens. Hydra is like decently tanky every level in the mid game, and then again same as Dark Priest, it's like good 20 and 21 and good on 15 in terms of damage as well. It's better on Is it? Yeah, it's probably better than Dark Priest, and 16, but... And I guess 12, but that's about it, so... I'd consider the units relatively comparable in that sense, and I would say they're generally fairly good. And sometimes will be just like pretty ridiculous, so, you know, there you go. Alright, Neo-Tank. So Neo-Tank is another one that gets shafted by the constraints of this tier list, but it's going to end up here. So unfortunately Neo-Tank just isn't good enough on enough levels to justify going any higher. It's good on 17, it's okay on 16, and then like if you can afford it for 8 it can be alright, but besides that it's pretty weak otherwise. The main reason it does go in this tier for me is because rather than any lower, it's because firstly it's like actually relatively solid on those levels I just mentioned, and secondly if you do have enough support, if you have like a Parasite, if you have Dark Mage, have Helicopter, you can think about just getting one Neo Tank, upgrading it, and then it will just fuck up whatever it hits on any level, and that can be quite useful. Like having a Neo Tank or a Doomsday that will like 2-shot Krakens and Behemoths and 1v1 a Fire Lord, like in some setups that will be very useful to you. In most it won't, but sometimes that will be quite good. So it's worth thinking about that even for say like 14, 15. And perhaps 21 as well, but quite weak against the creeps on all those 3 levels. So you need it with the right sort of setup, the right sort of friends to actually justify that, but sometimes it can work like that. Again, a unit that scales up into the endgame extremely, extremely well. And as I said, gets a bit shafted by the constraints of this specific list. But I think not enough games go to the end game, and it would skew the rating of a lot of these units a little too much to include it in this list. And that was basically why I didn't. Alright, Minotaur is... Unfortunately, it basically just sucks. I feel a bit bad saying it, but I've tried to make this unit work. It's pretty bad. The stun is alright, but you pay a lot for the stun, and it kind of just feels like that's all it is. This unit just... I don't know why, but it just feels squishy as hell. So I'm not a fan of Minotaur, not a fan of Bigfoot. Even on 14, I don't like the unit very much. I don't think it does enough. So yeah, would generally dislike it. Generally try and stay away from it. I've tried it a couple of times recently in FPG with significant disappointment attached to its performance, unfortunately, so I think this unit is pretty bad overall. Next up we have Ig. Ig is good. Ig is going in this tier because Tree of Knowledge. Like Ig itself, early game you can play it and you can hold 7 and it's fine, or with a couple of adds you can get into a Tok and then it's really good. But mostly just mid game, it's you build 3 Toks for 14, 15 and 4 Toks for like 17, and it kills almost all of the creeps, and then you just build things to hit the sends, and if you have, you know, 300 below the value that you'd think would be good enough, you'll just go mid. It's like, oh, cool, guess I'm good at the game. No, Tok is just very, very, very strong, but it does need ranged units. It doesn't work very well. It doesn't play very nicely with melee units. And yeah, so not a lot else to say. Ig is really good. Tok is insane on 21. Ig is pretty solid early, but it's a little bit vulnerable. This rating is mostly from the strength of Tok, and not very much from the unupgraded Ig in the early game, because I don't value Ig that highly early game at the moment. Just based on level 10 being so much more important than level 7 to my eyes. Right, next up we have the Flamebeard, the Fire Lord. So this guy's going in niche. No, this guy's going in usable. Sorry, I've got the as I said, I've got the tier list next to me to make sure I don't like randomly change everything up from where I've already thought it out. This guy is... You can use him on 7, but generally I would not. He's really, really good on 13. good on 21. It's like usable on 50. He's usable on like 20. He's pretty decent on 15. And then it's like he's got a support aura that it's like it feels basically like Oracle aura. If we're talking about levels that the big dude with the mace hitting things isn't very good. Feels like it's an Oracle aura that you're like paying a lot for, which is obviously not very good. But you know, it's there. So if you're building him for like 13 or 15 or whatever, and you know, you have those lava tiles, you're going to use them, right? So I'd say, you know, this guy is sometimes going to be good. Most of the time he's not going to be very good. I would not build him for 7. Basically for 3 reasons. Number 1 is getting to building him for 7 is going to absolutely just slaughter your early game. You're weak against every send. You're desperately you want your team to feed you. At the same time, you're like, please don't let them scout me or they'll send 5 and 6 and I will die like a rat. Then you're really good on 7. And then you suck on 8 and you suck on 10. So it's like, maybe I won't build this. Yeah, you know, he's good at a few things. For the most part, he's not great, but you can kind of use it and it kind of works. Right, Steamroller. This guy's gone up in my estimation a lot, actually. And I'm just going to say this unit's alright. He likes auras, likes support, but even without them, he can do pretty well. Basically every mid-game level with the exception of 20 and 21 where he's not great. If you can afford him on level 8, he's also a pretty good unit on level 8 for you. So yeah, Steamroller, I'm going to say Steamroller is solid. I will say the upgrade Assault Tank I think is basically horrible. Feels like you kind of have to start doing it in the end game just to get any mileage out of the unit, just because the range does help in the end game, but it's fucking expensive for not a lot. So I do not think Assault Tank is a good unit. The upgraded one, I would, even if I have a helicopter for 17, I'm still going Steamrollers. That's how bad I think Assault Tank is, basically. So unlucky Assault Tank, but at least your little brother's good. Right, next up we have the Azure Dragon. I like this unit, I like Azzy Dragon, but he sucks. He's really bad. He's like kinda sorta good on 13. And look, there's a reasonable tier list could have these 4 units in this tier, this guy alone in basically always garbage, and then Watcher. But I'm gonna leave it like this. Another reasonable tier list would have this guy down here, but I want Watcher to have its own tier below everything else because I fucking hate Watcher. It is so bad. And Azure Dragon, you are almost as bad. But you are pretty good on 13, and you're kind of okay on 21. So I'm gonna leave it where it is. But it is a bad unit. I would stay away from it. The only thing it can do is wall clog against flying levels because a lot of things will hit it and get slowed by the shield. And it's like then kind of tanky, but it does not do even close to enough to actually, for even me to say it's good on 13 or 21. It's like, it's okay on 2 levels. That probably shouldn't, but does, in my opinion, just squeak it out of the Watcher tier, but if I had to pick a second worst unit in the game, it would be this one. Alright, lastly we have the Odin, so the Dwarf King. Pretty good unit. Not insane, but a pretty good unit. If you can get the first one for level 5, second one for level 7, upgrade 2 of them for level 10, you can definitely make a carry out of that. Appreciates, again, things like Dwarf Tier 2, Slave Master, Clockwork, probably Clockwork to a slightly lesser extent, because it's relatively tanky itself. But yeah, likes those sort of ads. Then the upgraded one is pretty solid, like most of the mid-game, or at least the early mid-game it's solid 14-15. After the nerfs it's definitely a little bit worse. Before the nerfs it was here, possibly here. I'd say now it just ends up in the, yeah, it's generally pretty good tier. So yeah, it's like solid unit. Don't have a lot more to say about it. It's difficult to actually like get into with a lot of setups. So a fair amount of the time you have this unit, you're just sort of going to ignore it. But sometimes you have this unit, you're going to use it and feel pretty good about it. So yeah, that'll be the finishing of the tier list. So what might actually be fun to do for me, now I'm just thinking of it later, is sort of compare how units have moved from the last tier list to this one. But I think we'll wrap it up there for now. Obviously, any questions or, you know, opinions that differ from mine, let us know in the comments. I'd be interested to hear them. But yeah, for now, guys, cheers very much for watching. I appreciate it. Like, subscribe, all of that. As always, thank you to my patrons. You guys are legends, and I'll catch you in the next one. Cheers.